Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final full chapter for Book 1 of The Sands Beneath the Moon. I'd like to thank everyone for their patience awaiting this chapter. Finishing a story for the first time is a bit of a daunting task. After the release of this audio, I will be working on a brief epilogue to set up the next book in the series, which I expect should take about a week or two. After that, I'll be starting on Book 2 and resuming my earlier schedule of bi-weekly releases. Thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoy the audio. The scarlet glow that draped the land around the spire was far less oppressive in the entrance hall of the structure. Small slits in the red walls allowed in a bit of the tainted light cast by the gem atop the structure, as did the shattered door through which the group, consisting primarily of bloodied Northmen, had entered. Yet, compared to the region outside of the tower, the gentler white light from the enchanted stones they carried seemed to hold a greater sway over the atmosphere than the relatively subdued trickle of corrupted sunlight from outside of the tower. Despite the fact that the warband were undeniably in the heart of their enemy's domain, despite the fact that they were as far from safety as they had ever been, the crimson light, mostly giving way to the soft glow, had a calming effect on those present, though that white light also had its origins in sorcery. Though the ruby-topped citadel of Thelasama had been breached, the warriors who had penetrated it were greatly reduced, and all among them, with the exception of their own sorcerer, had been injured in some fashion during the battle at the gates, or during the vicious conflict amid the dunes the night prior. The northern warriors and their nomadic guide could still stand. However, the combination of blood loss and exhaustion had reaped a toll to a greater or lesser degree upon all of them. Scarson was missing a chunk of flesh on his shoulder, and he bore many cuts from small claws on his forearms. His golden hair was stained with blood, and his primary concern was applying pressure to stem the bleeding from his shoulder. Vailif assisted the most wounded of the Northmen to sit against the wall and bandage his injuries, one who favored a spear, and who had come to his aid against the ape thing the prior night. The nomadic woman, for her part, sank to her knees and recited a quick prayer to Varsha, as she attempted to steady her trembling mind. Kyrus, too, was covered in blood, although in his case none of it was his own. Rather, the warlock's hands and arms were stained with the black ichor of the imp, which he had slaughtered in order to cast the spell that had broken through the red tower's nearly impervious door. Aside from the older wound in his side, that was well on its way to healing, the sorcerer was fully intact. His nerves were not shaken the way the desert dwellers were, nor was he busy assisting another companion with their wounds, as Vailif was. Naturally, this made Kyrus the swiftest to take in the details of the tower's entrance level. The room was vast, of course. He could have discerned as much from a simple glance at the tower's exterior. What was more remarkable than the size of the structure, and more damning as well, was its decor. Murals had been rendered upon the walls by crude and inexpert hands, depicting strange scenes of serpents devouring primitively armed humans, clad in fur and hide garments in a variety of environments, from the temples to jungles to the desert itself. Some humans were bloody and struggling in a battle they had clearly already lost. Others were frozen in fear, paralyzed in such a manner as to not even manage a token of resistance against their inevitable doom. Despite the low detail of the murals, the fear and pain rendered upon the faces of the men and women being consumed was quite an unsettling thing to behold, even by the standards of Kyrus, though he had seen far more terrible fates befall men at his time. Perhaps it was the cold and impersonal predation in the eyes of the serpent, so unlike the eyes of men, which produced a certain degree of discomfort from him. Accompanying the mural hanging from the far end of the room, and positioned before a staircase, was a great statue. This feature was unlike the one which had first caught the sorcerer's eye, in that it was clearly carved by a master artisan, and evoked an armored serpent whose head rose 10 feet above the floor, where a portion of its elongated body remained coiled, and who possessed two dexterous yet inhuman hands, one of which held a silvery blade, and another an ornate golden scepter. This was the representation of a cunning and well-formed creature, which much resembled the dark beast Scarson had slain in the desert, but possessed a regal bearing which even that elegant facsimile had lacked. Cyrus knew immediately that what was being depicted here was no creation of man, but of long-forgotten devils, though the sorcerer residing in this tower, in some fit of madness, must be seeking to recreate its ilk. The peculiar and gruesome artwork in the chamber would eventually draw the eye of the warlock's traveling companions. While Cyrus refrained from any outward displays of shock or revulsion, the nomad, still on her knees in prayer, gave a sharp intake of breath as she became aware of her surroundings, and the bleeding warriors all muttered curses beneath their breath. Whether any of them truly realized the significance of what they were witnessing, or whether it was simply a sign to them of the diseased mind of a witch, Cyrus could not say. There was no time now for conversations regarding the long extinct and nearly forgotten near-human races, or the forms of magic associated with them. The answers to his questions regarding the insanity manifest in the Red Tower, and the nature of the knowledge hoarded by the tower's master, lay no doubt above, among the spire's highest floors. The sorcerer was just about to voice his thoughts that it was about time they got moving again, when Scarson beat him to it. "Belcor, Valif, I want you two guarding this doorway in case the witch we're hunting tries to circle around us and escape. Keep your eyes and your ears open. I don't doubt we've killed most of his creatures, but a witch this foul always has more tricks up his sleeve. And you, woman." Scarson turned his attention to the nomad, who remained unnamed. His face was grim and thoughtful. "Stick close, but if we fall, run. You don't want to be caught in the sorcerer's grasp." The chieftain, whose bleeding had been stemmed by several bandages, led the way in their ascent up the crimson-painted stairs behind the beautifully crafted yet ultimately unsettling statue at the far end of the room from its entrance. Following him was another haggard-looking warrior, the hunched form of Cyrus, and an exceptionally hesitant-looking dusky-skinned woman. There was no red light in the stairwell, nor the level above. Only a darkness that seemed to resist the light shed by the spell-bound stones they each carried, in a manner similar to a heavy fog. The entire tower reeked with the smell of sorcery, but now ascending the upper floors, the spell made the Northman grimace and reminded the Elentrian of home. Of greater concern than reminiscence was the heavy dragging sound along the floor beyond the dim and smothered light generated by Cyrus's magic. There was little else in the way of warning that preceded chaos erupting in the dark chamber. The intruders had waded some distance into the gloomy room, further than the nomad felt should be entirely possible given the apparent size of the tower. Even the sorcerer Cyrus was growing increasingly ill at ease with the situation, for his eyes, adapted as they were to a life among shadows, could not penetrate the bewitched darkness of this chamber, which felt less like a room and more like the void itself. No one spoke for what seemed like minutes. The sorcerer's hand drifted closer to the pocket of his robe, which contained the crystal vial filled with the black substance he had collected from the shadow thing. But the ominous atmosphere was shattered when Scarson heard that slithering noise pass by his right leg, and with characteristic speed and dexterity, drove the point of his sword downward into thick hide. Unfortunately, whatever had been struck did not have the good grace to die. From behind the invaders there came a sound that registered somewhere between a screech and a hiss. Not even a second later, they were all buffeted off their feet by a furious thrashing mass. As the sounds of scrambling and scuffling rang out from all around him, Cyrus, for the first time in a very long time, was nearly overwhelmed by a sense of fear. He was blind in this darkness, without any concept of what was attacking him or any means by which to ascertain the chaotic situation swirling around him. All he knew was that he was on his back, and by the sound of one Northman's dying scream, mortality was near at hand. The sorcerer was not entirely unfamiliar with death or terror, and reached a shaking hand into his robes to take hold of the crystal bottle. Yet, before he could seize it, another hand seized his arm, an unmistakably human one, too small to belong to Scarson, though by no means delicate. It hauled the sorcerer to his feet with a soft grunt of effort. The sound of metal cleaving into flesh, and another screech from somewhere in the dark, indicated that nearby Scarson was still fighting with whatever beast had been set upon them. But in this confused and shrouded mayhem, Kyrus and the Nomad were as likely to be cut down by whirling steel as the abomination the Northman was engaged with. Thus the Varshan ran without heed to where, for there was no way of knowing, other than that it was away from the sounds of combat. Kyrus did not hesitate to follow. The pair sprinted through the suffocating darkness. The Nomad clung to the sorcerer's arm with a vice-like grip. No matter how unsightly Kyrus was, or what black arts he practiced, it was painfully clear that he was now her only hope of escaping the Ruby Tower alive. The desert dweller had managed to keep hold of the glowing stone when she had crashed to the ground, but its presence still did little good. Surrounded as they were by the void-like enchantment that strangled all light and seemed to stretch space in unnatural ways. She held the stone out in the desperate hope that it might reveal something, anything, indicating a path of escape. An instant later she pitched forward and collided face first with a hard surface as her foot connected with the first step in a staircase. Kyrus this time managed to keep his footing, forewarned of the hurdle by his companion's ungraceful and abrupt collision with the stone. The sorcerer wrenched slightly as the Nomad's grip tightened. He took the lead, and they passed further away from the abyssal chamber. The Elentrian sight returned to him far more quickly than the Varshans as they slipped out of range of whatever spell had shrouded the spire's second floor in that fog of impossible shadow. By the time the two reached the end of the staircase, the tower's walls again glowed with that uneasy red light, which both the Nomad and the sorcerer found eminently preferable to pitch darkness. And, more fortunately, the enchanted rock that the Nomad had held onto glowed once more. Kyrus glanced down the stairwell, which was empty. Though he no longer heard the sounds of a battle raging below, the warlock had absolutely no intention of heading back into the dark chamber to attempt to discern the victor of the bloody conflict. Even if Scarson had won, that would risk the chance of being cut down in the dark by the instinct of the warrior. An instinct Kyrus was not sure would distinguish him as a friend instead of a foe. The warlock turned his gaze to the Nomad, who still looked somewhat fearful, but was composing herself rather well, all things considered. Her face was a bit red from where she had impacted the stone. Still, she had no fresh injuries, and the bandage on her arm remained intact. The warlock decided this was not an appropriate time or place to remark that he was impressed by her fortitude. He suspected, or at least hoped, that the dreaded Thelasama was close at hand. "I will have numerous questions when we find the master of this tower." The sorcerer's opening statement did little to help the woman control her nerves. Instead, it served to accentuate that the closest thing she had to a protector in this awful and profane spire was as steeped in dark lore as the man who built it. For a moment, the Nomad appeared to reach her wits' end, and looked to be deciding whether to start shouting at the witchman, flee back into the dark chamber, or cry. Kyrus proceeded quickly, before she had time to make that decision. "Of course I very much intend to kill him. His power is great, but his fascination with serpents and his proficiency in magic even I have not seen the like of, concerns me more than it intrigues me. The spellcraft he invokes is either an unprecedented series of innovations, or he has somehow gained access to knowledge of sorcery not practiced since the Elder days. Either possibility gives me cause to doubt whether I would be his match in a fair confrontation." While it was reassuring that Kyrus had no intentions of joining the sorcerer of the Ruby Tower in his madness, the lack of certainty from the Elantrian as to whether he could overcome Thellasama caught her attention. The nomad's expression faltered as she spoke again in a quiet tone. "You're suggesting we might well be doomed?" she asked, held from panic only by the calmness in her own sorcerer's demeanor. A twisted grin spread across the Elantrian's face when he answered. "I set out certain that I would be the superior of our enemy, a classically trained sorcerer from the oldest traditions of human magic, against a hermit dabbling on his own in the middle of a desert. Nonetheless, a sorcerer who intends to live a full life must always prepare for the worst outcome. Thus, I crafted a weapon." The warlock produced the crystal bottle filled with a sort of black liquid, and held it out to the nomad, who flinched for a moment when offered the obviously profane object. "When Thellasama and I engage each other with magic, when I hold his entire focus, I want you to open this. No matter how skilled in the sorcerous arts he may be, it will destroy him if it can catch him off guard." Kyrus explained as he continued to hold out the bottle, which the nomad accepted, only with immense reluctance, questioning as she did so. "What manner of wickedness have you bottled in here, witch?" She could not bring herself to stifle her disgusted scowl as she examined the strange viscous contents of the ornate and beautifully crafted bottle. Yet beneath the scowl was now a curiosity mingled with a sort of hope that no matter how foul, Kyrus's wicked arts might offer some chance at survival. "It is Thellasama's own magic, his shadow, bent towards my will and bottled until it was needed. I do not believe a sorcerer of the caliber to reside in such a place as this, and command such servants as the ones we have faced, would consider you much of a threat. I suspect once hostilities commence he will intend to slay me and take you for his experiments or as a source of blood for his rituals." The casual tone in which Kyrus mentioned the terrible fate that may well await the woman was enough to chill her blood. The bottle she was holding, filled with a creature bound through the black arts of Elentria, did little to ease her revulsion. This bottle was not the glowing rock, a bit of simple magic she could easily wrap her head around and ignore the vile origin of. She was being asked to help release a terrible dark sorcery upon another human being, even one who was himself an example of the deepest corruption. After several moments, the fear Kyrus had helped instill within her overpowered her revulsion at the idea of being complicit in such an act of heresy. She slid the bottle into her loose cloth garments, next to where she kept her dagger, and nodded without complaint. She would beg forgiveness from her goddess later, but she would not fall prey to Thellasama or his abominations today. "Splendid," Kyrus said, with a nod of his own, and the closest thing someone like him could manage to a reassuring smile. It was not particularly reassuring. The sorcerer pushed open the door ahead of the pair. He was on edge, and his formidable senses were alert for dangers both physical and metaphysical in nature. The room he entered reeked of magic, but it was not quite so sharp as the acidic scent Kyrus had smelled in great potency so often of late. Within the chamber there was no arcane trap or blasphemous creation, nor were there currently spells being cast. The stench was mustier, older. This room was a place where a great deal of sorcery had been studied and worked, which had left a mark that no exotic perfume or incense could conceal, although, from the great number of burners hanging from the ceiling, someone had evidently tried. Aside from the numerous incense lamps scattered throughout the room, and the sweet smell of perfume and spices that mingled with foul odors, the study they had entered bore all the hallmarks of a sorcerer consumed by obsession. To begin with, the bookshelves that lined the walls of the circular space were almost empty, merely because their contents were scattered across the floor, in addition to cluttering the desk on the far side of the room. There were a more than healthy number of loose notes and torn pages which assisted the clutter, joined by arcane implements, ornate daggers, ceremonial bowls, and tools that a layman would not recognize. A sitting table in the middle of the room bore a few of these apparatuses as well, but they were buried in the more pedestrian signs of a disorganized mind: half-eaten meals, trays, a tea kettle, which had been heated perhaps several days ago before being left unattended and half full. The space was not a particularly comfortable one beneath its current state either. Its furniture, including chairs and a bench near a sitting table, were worn and uncushioned. They, along with the tables and the bookshelves, appeared to have been carved by an unskilled hand. One could suppose these surfaces functioned, yet did little to please the eye. Cyrus, being from a sunless land himself, did not take note of the lack of a window, though he did notice the chamber was lit only by an oppressive red glow from the walls of the tower itself, instead of the light-producing spell used by the witch-kings of his homeland. By far the most distinct part of the room, which held nearly the entirety of the nomad's attention, was the layer of dry and shed reptilian skin that covered almost every inch of the floor. The crunching sound produced by Cyrus's boots as he passed beyond the doorway nearly made her retch with disgust. She kept well behind the sorcerer, and did her best to draw as little attention to herself as possible, when her companion's eyes settled on a solitary figure seated at a desk on the other end of the room. A figure who was hunched over his work and facing away from them, until the crunch of dead reptilian skin beneath the intruder's feet bid him turn around. Thellasama was not deformed as Cyrus was. His limbs were not gangly. His teeth were not sharp. His dusky skin was not of an unnatural hue, and his fingers did not end in nails which much resembled claws. If anything, the man's features were aristocratic in spite of his origins, though he bore dark circles beneath his eyes much as the Elentrian sorcerer did, a mark of dedicated scholarship. His black hair hung wild, and his brown eyes bore no trace of fog or mania, only a sharp, perceptive clarity. Those eyes did not linger long on the woman from the desert. Instead, they fixed on the hunched man from the old heartland. In his hand he held a staff, not a wooden and gnarled one, as Cyrus held, but a gilded and bejeweled metallic object, bearing the head of a serpent, which was bowed in a crook, with its maw open. "My servants told me you were dangerous, though I hadn't expected anyone to make it to my study without an entire army at their back. Proves me the fool here, I suppose. I'd have tidied up a bit, if I was expecting guests." The sorcerer from the realm of Varsha had a pleasant and cordial manner of speaking, that would have seemed more at home amid a grand hall than the crimson-lit nightmare in which he resided. Even the warlock from Elentria was taken aback by the geniality of the greeting. It did little to put Cyrus or his nomadic companion at ease, however, for Cyrus knew well the nature of sorcerers, and the woman from the desert felt the same instinctive unease looking upon this man and his handsome features as she did looking upon the malformed witch who now accompanied her. If anything, she registered this stranger as a far greater threat, for the monster at her side displayed his nature openly, and had proven unlikely to strike out against her. It was Cyrus who spoke, while she attempted to make herself look as small as possible at his side. "I would have considered locking away your beasts and serpent a more suitable form of hospitality," Cyrus responded in a dry tone. He looked over the room, which was nearly as terrible a sight as could be glimpsed in the tower of any witch-king he'd had the profound displeasure of visiting. The warm chuckle that met his sarcastic remark did nothing to lower the interloping sorcerer's guard. "Quite. Neglecting to do so was terribly impolite of me, although I would consider it a greater lapse in etiquette that you arrived here with the intent to murder your host." It was to this remark, accompanied by the magnetic and almost apologetic smile, that the woman of the desert felt her temple flare, granting her a brief rashness, which bid her to interject. "Etiquette! From a man whose beasts attempted to drag me off and harvest my blood, and Varsha knows what else! Hang your etiquette, and hang you along with it!" The sudden flash of boldness and anger drew upon her the attention of Thellasama, whose eyes, briefly possessed a quality so dangerous as to render her mute once more. The interlude in the desert sorcerer's charming demeanor was mercifully brief. His face donned a significantly more patient and placating smile, vaguely condescending in its nature. Such circumstances are most regrettable. There was a time when I had no need to send my servants to scour the road for those such as yourself. A time not so long ago, when Amir Shan was more than happy to send me the pick of Janaba's criminals for my rituals and experiments, in exchange for making those most vocally opposed to his ruling policies disappear. Blood flowed here like wine in those days. Belisama gave a longing sigh, as his smile turned genuine and whimsical for the instant of his recollection, then, once again, hardened into something more diplomatic. I must admit it was my own blunder that marked the end of that relationship. A flaw in one of my servants, a spider-like beast with grafted scales that bent the light to help it remain hidden in spite of its size. I considered it a truly elegant creation, and I remained quite proud of its form. I must have made a mistake when sculpting its mind, however. Instead of striking from the shadows as I had intended, it went mad and tore its way through the market square in Janaba. Such were the political ramifications that the emir was forced to sever our private ties and send his soldiers after my head. A regrettable situation, I'm certain you'll both agree, but I know at least one of you is aware of how temperamental the artistry of such servants can be at times. Thetlasama gave an acknowledging nod towards his fellow sorcerer, who seemed only mildly interested in the turn the conversation had taken. The Elentrian was aware that his companion's people tended to be rather more centered in morality than his own. What he failed to see the logic of was berating for his ethics a man they intended to soon be dead. The nomad, by contrast, appeared thoroughly disgusted, but had regained the sense to hold her tongue, as Kyrus moved to guide the conversation back towards what he considered most urgent. I'm more interested in your serpent men. You have labored to refine them. You decorate the entrance to your tower with them. The floor of this room is covered by shed scales. Why? And the way you use gems to twist the light of the sun. Even among sorcerers of my homeland, that is a magic few dare even dream of. The Elentrian sorcerer had noticed that his counterpart was more than eager to talk about himself and his craft. This sort of boastfulness was not an uncommon trait among young sorcerers in Elentria. However, it was certainly a more scarce trait among their elders, as such talkative men rarely lived to experience the grim luxury of old age. Thalasama, for all the brilliance of his craft, had clearly never lived among the treachery of other sorcerers. I see the wariness in your eyes, my friend. Do you believe that I am insane to reproduce the serpent men who once dined upon our kind in the elder days? Or to have studied magic and human in origin, when you, forgive me, are barely human yourself? Kyrus's adversary was more observant than he had predicted. The sorcerer from the desert had recognized the caution upon his inhuman features. But Kyrus had been correct in so far as his adversary's pride outstripped even his cunning. The sorcerer who had never known a peer or rival could not resist boasting about the refinement of his art to one who might, in some capacity, understand its struggles and implications. It is not madness or a misplaced vendetta against my own race which has drawn me to my studies. When I first fled Janaba, I had dived into only the most paltry aspects of sorcery. I had attempted to create a dark servant of my own, but the blood I harvested was from a gutter rat like myself, for I had little knowledge of the importance of quality in those days. My attempt was a failure, and a messy one at that, yet in my exile, as I wandered north and west, a fair-faced stranger appeared in my dreams. He told me that I had done well to take my first steps along a path of true ambition, and guided me towards the westward coast and south along the shores until the sands became foliage and the sun was swallowed by a jungle canopy. In that jungle I found a cave. Inside of that cave was a crumbling city, a mausoleum to a species long vanished from the world. At the heart of that grand tomb I found a single book, clutched tightly in the grip of a near-human corpse. For a year I studied that tome, feeding off rats and insects and drinking the water of an ancient well. I could not read the language at first. However, the man from my dreams spoke to me at times and made clear the meaning of that wonderful book. It taught me much. Soon I crafted my first dark creatures after posing as a jungle guide in a nearby city and luring a few unwary travelers to their doom. These crude beasts furnished me with far better food and far greater comfort as I turned my attention towards the city's library. Kyrus was listening to the tale very intently after the other warlock's monologue. He had hoped to learn the source of Thellasama's strange power. It had been his estimation thus far that the Varshan's magic must have been taught to him by some ancient court, or perhaps a particularly eccentric witch king who had made his way south and stumbled upon knowledge ancient and inhuman. This talk of a specter appearing in dreams and leading men towards the remnants of near-human sorcery was a troubling revelation, if Thellasama spoke truthfully. As for why I am so intent to revive the serpent folk in a fashion, who would not wish to be the god of such a gifted and ingenious species? They are a cruel and calculating race, and if I could recreate them, bound to my will, Janaba, perhaps the entire dominion of Varsha and its scattered cities from the southern oceans to the border of the old heartland could be mine. The handsome sorcerer finally stopped speaking for a moment. He surveyed his counterpart, whose twisted features were partially hidden by his cloak, and his tone became less subdued, more energetic, as he made his offer. But as you can no doubt see, I've reached a limit I cannot breach. I created dark beasts that imitate the serpent men of old in form and power, but they are difficult to produce, and cannot themselves create more of their kind, being sterile as all such creatures are. I could learn a great deal from you, Kyrus, and teach you a great deal as well. I have never been one to share what is mine, but if we were to synthesize our knowledge, born of different branches of sorcery, perhaps we could find a way to subvert its apparent laws. Give me the girl, and help me slay the rest of your companions, and I will write you your first lesson in their blood. Towards the end of Thellasama's speech, Kyrus spoke a word in the dark tongue of his people. His staff crackled to life with crimson magic. The Elentrian had the knowledge he sought, and absolutely no interest in the dubious prospect of ruling over a land of man-eating serpents. Thus, the rival sorcerer's usefulness to him had reached its end. Yet, as the blast of red magic, which would have torn the flesh from Thellasama's bones, hurtled through the air, it began to dissipate, dissolving into the strange light of the room as the walls pulsed with their ruby hue. The ancient magics imbued within the tower had somehow dispersed his hasty attack on its master. This was the Varshan sorcerer's domain, and he was not quite foolish enough to lack contingencies altogether. Kyrus's eyes widened only briefly, as Thellasama blinked in a shock which seemed more indignant than wrathful. The inaction did not last long from either man. Thellasama raised his ornate staff and spoke profane words that caused a mote of green flame to spit from the mouth of the serpentine head of his staff towards Kyrus. The malformed sorcerer was only a split second faster, and dived to his right, dropping his staff in the process while narrowly avoiding the flames which seared through the dried skin on the floor where he had been standing, and scorched the stone surface beneath. The dark-skinned warlock aimed his staff once again, and began to speak, but this time the witch-man was quicker, and hurled his black cloak at his opponent. The desperate move caught Thellasama, who had assumed the other sorcerer to be defenseless without a staff, off guard. The cloak caught the master of the tower full in the face, The fabric blinded him and muffled his incantations for only a mere instant before he tore it away and cast it aside. However, in that brief period of confusion, Kyrus had closed the distance with his ritual blade. Neither man had time to cast an incantation. Neither man was adept at close fighting, but both were desperate, and Thelasama wielded his metal scepter like a club. During the quick exchange, Kyrus managed to deal several painful, though not immediately lethal wounds with his ornate dagger, before a heavy blow to the face sent him crashing to the ground and knocked loose a tooth. Thelasama raised his staff with the intent to bludgeon his fallen enemy to death. But in their brief exchange, the nomad by the stairs had managed to open the crystal bottle Kyrus had given her with fumbling hands. From the dark liquid of the container, which rose and spilled out of its own volition, a semi-tangible human-sized shadow formed and swept towards Thelasama with blinding speed in aid of its new master. It was the shadow thing that had slain the warrior Vargas, which Kyrus had not destroyed. The warlock of the old heartland had instead trapped the creature and bound it to him through use of his own blood, for just such a dire situation as he now found himself in. The master of the tower scarcely had time to raise his staff and shout before the shadow struck him in much the same manner the cloak had moments ago. The inky substance that made up the shadow thing forced its way down its former master's throat with the same agonizing brutality it would use for any other victim. Thelasama's jaw was dislocated, then relocated at least twice. His neck bulged, and his face contorted as bones were crushed and then forced back into place by the semi-material essence which now inhabited his body. This shadow creature was not healing him. Instead, it acted as a sort of adhesive to hold fragments of bone together, so that he looked unchanged from the outside, save for the pain and terror in his eyes. "Hold him," Kyrus commanded his servant, as he rose and walked over to the wide-eyed woman near the door to collect his crystal bottle and its cork from her still shaking hands. She did not protest, nor did she turn away, compelled to watch the scene in a sort of morbid fascination not fully understood to her. Kyrus did not scramble to return to his adversary, who had been rendered mute and immobile by his own creation. Nor did he dally too long. Thelasama was an irritatingly competent sorcerer, and the Elentrian was not going to risk giving him time to find some way to free himself. "You did well. You don't have to watch what happens next," the warlock from the Heartland assured his greatly shaken companion in a surprisingly gentle tone. In her eyes, he saw a reflection of his own past, times when he had been made to watch his master dispose of other apprentices who had displeased him. Kyrus did not dwell on this. He turned from her to approach his now defenseless prey. She did not look away, for she had unleashed this doom the witch had handed to her, and in some respect did not regret doing so. Kyrus stood before Thelasama with his ritual knife in one hand and the apparently fragile container in the other. He reached up the hand which held his blade and rubbed the place where the other sorcerer had struck him across his twisted face with 2 fingers. As he met the eyes of his prey, and spoke in a supremely dry tone of voice, "I do believe you have spoiled my dashing features." Without further ado, he slit the throat of the terrified man, and let the shadow substance flow out of the wound in Thelasama's throat and back into his bottle. A second later, Thelasama's lifeless body collapsed like a puppet whose strings had just been cut. Minutes after the death of the spire's master, Kyrus had ascended one further flight of stairs. An hour later, the glow of the great gem faded, and the ruby structure that shed evil light throughout its vicinity was reduced to a monolith of inert red stone. A day, a night, and a second day passed before anyone exited the dim tower. There was a man in a dark cloak carrying a pack laden down with scrolls and implements he had deemed useful. There was a woman with an injured arm and a satchel of gems slung over her shoulder, which Kyrus had assured her were untainted by magic, and insisted she should help herself to, given her status stranded without kin or clan. The warlock would have found it distasteful to leave her vulnerable to Nanhay's plans for indentured servitude after the peril they had faced together. With the first two figures were three variously wounded warriors, including their chieftain. They had certainly not been shy about asking the sorcerer what gold and gems had not been cursed, and each carried a surprising quantity of riches in spite of their injuries. The five figures were bound for the same destination. Each was well rested and well fed by food from the tower, and each had a full water skin. A luminous and whole moon shone overhead, guiding them unerringly in the march through the dusty sands and rolling dunes, back to the ivory walls and azure spires of Janaba.